Thanks to all for joining and to those listening to the recording post-event. I'm Garry Tough and I lead the client engagement activities within the Endava Private Equity Group, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this webinar on how technology provides patient and caregivers with ownership, accountability and transparency of data. And we're today going to be focusing crucially on the delivery of tangible, measurable benefits and outcomes. A little context set up first. My team has supported around 22 healthcare investments, health tech investments of late, with over 20 private equity funds specialising in health tech across the UK, Australia, Germany, Nordics, Benelux, and of course the USA, the largest market. And these projects have spanned wearable health tech, software development, clinical research, industrial equipment supply, patient communications, testing and diagnostic services. And today I'm very pleased to introduce you to our expert panel, Dr. Jillian Halley and Adrian Sutherland. By way of introduction, Dr. Halley joined Endava towards the end of last year following speciality training in Australia and Canada. She returned to the UK in 2000 and has worked as a frontline medical consultant in paediatric intensive care. Her interest in medical technology led from online mentoring in the ICU in the early 90s, including postgrad research into signal processing of heart rate variability, to designing and implementing software that enables process improvement in healthcare, and most recently to the development of a digital personalised healthcare record. Adrian Sutherland is a senior health tech architect at Endava and has worked in healthcare IT for many years in the UK, Europe and indeed the US. And this includes senior roles in the UK's NHS, National Programme, Australia's Personally Controlled Health Record and the US Healthcare Management System Modernisation, as well as other projects for providers and payers. Adrian has also co-authored publications on patient engagement, wellness and user interfaces for clinical systems. So, by way of housekeeping, please do use the chat function on the control panel in front of you on your screen to submit any questions, and we will endeavour to answer those as we go. We'd very much like to make this as interactive as possible. So for now, let me free the floor and hand you over to our panel for today.
Hello, everybody. My name's Gillian, and I was going to kick off with the first slide that we have to give you a little bit of context, just for 5 minutes, on a population basis in the healthcare system, because as most of you will know, the healthcare system is very complex. There's lots of components, different organisations, and it's sometimes difficult to get your head around that if you're not working inside it. So looking at it from a population perspective, because we're really trying to be as patient-centred as possible in this talk, give some context about where that data might be coming from and how it should be managed. So from the bottom of the pyramid, everybody, the whole population, this is universal healthcare. The sort of things that would be in here is obviously public health measures, safe water and good food, etc., advice on eating and diet, exercise and general sort of public health initiatives, along with screening, so to be cancer screening or screening for inherited conditions, immunizations, vaccinations like COVID, all of that fits in there for everybody. And the majority of people don't regularly interface with the healthcare system itself, but they still need those services. And from a tech point of view, you would see things like the COVID app, the NHS front door app, wellness and fitness tracking devices, screening, sort of moving towards maybe some portable scanners in supermarket car parks that you might have heard about, hospital EPR systems, and there's a genetic profiling risk, etc., that might fit in there. So the sort of data you'll get, so people will have their own data through their personal health and wellness apps. COVID obviously generated a lot of data, and that was fed back into the government, anonymised, to give us feedback on how things are going. There's also data that can come out from genetic screening, for example. We can talk about that a bit later in more detail. So who should that data be shared with and how? And so the main thing about this section of the pyramid is it's about prevention, really. It's about having an opportunity for prevention and to have the population stay well and be informed. And as you go up the pyramid, the next section, there's the long-term health conditions. So in the UK, for example, 24% of people have 2 or more long-term conditions. And those could be things like diabetes. It could be diabetes type 1 from childhood. It could be diabetes type 2. It could be things like respiratory conditions, asthma, cystic fibrosis. It could be congenital heart disease. Those are childhood conditions that have got increasing life survival now. It could be COPD in adults. It could be someone who's diagnosed with Parkinson's, who's still got a significant number of years ahead of them, or people with dementia or mental health conditions. So the sort of tech we would have there could be about home monitoring, so blood pressure, ECGs, blood tests, peak flow tests, blood sugars, but also things like falls prevention or tracking movement disorders like Parkinson's disease. There's a bit recently in the press you might have seen about tech that will help Parkinson's patients to stay well at home, and also other tech that's around trying to identify where someone who's living alone with dementia may have got into difficulty, like they're not doing certain things or the behaviour has changed. So the data's got quite a bit of value, and the thing about this section really is about self-care. So how can technology help people to look after themselves, avoid hospital admissions and stay safe at home? And that's kind of targeted usually at 1 or more conditions. So moving up to the last part of the pyramid, and as you go up there, the complexity goes up and the cost per patient goes up. So this is a low volume population, but high complexity and high cost. People can move up and down the pyramid as their conditions change, so it's according to need. So this section, these patients have more complex needs than can be managed by standard services alone. So they might have examples of this could be someone with a spinal injury who needs carers or who needs full-time care or who needs ventilators, wheelchairs, hoists, lots of technology in the home. It could be somebody with an end-of-life condition, could be someone with a rare disease. And so a lot of the exposure of these patients is really to many teams, many different organisations across health and social care. So it's lots of different workforce teams and lots of protocols, lots of documents, lots of information. And the big issue around that is about interoperability and integration from a tech perspective. So the technology they'll be exposed to could range from, let's say, ventilators, feeding pumps, could be eye gaze technology for people with motor neuron disease or voice banking. It could be remote monitoring and telemedicine so that they don't have to travel up to hospital and they can get as many tests as possible at home or close to home. And there's also an element of tech around their information management, from patient access to data through the NHS app, perhaps, to e-prescribing, and also access to their own information. And again, about integration and interoperability, not just across health, but health and social. So lots of data that could be valuable in improving the care of the individual patient, but also the care of the community of patients with that type of condition. And this population, in my experience, tend to be most willing to share their information. And almost all of them do share it in some ways, either with carers or with a community or peer group with similar conditions. Facebook groups are very common. And they also quite often will be in close contact with perhaps a specialised nurse or home care nurses, home care teams through texting, WhatsApp, etc. Obviously, that use of technology increased quite a bit during the pandemic as well. So one big issue around this is really to reduce service use. So how do we deliver personalised care, and how does technology enable that to improve quality of life and keep patients at home and as far as possible. So that's just to give some context. And then we have another pyramid. So I'm going to hand over to Adrian as we move to the next slide. And he will start us off at the bottom of that pyramid and we'll work our way up.
Thank you very much. Very much, Jillian. Yes, so I'm just to introduce myself, Adrian Sutherland, a healthcare architect at Endava. And we developed this pyramid and presented it to HIMSS earlier this year in the US. And we've also, I think there's a slide just with a link to it. We've also got a white paper which talks about many of the things that expand on them that we're going to talk about today. And before I really talk about the pyramid, I think we all know what technology can do. I don't think we don't need to talk too much today about, the power of artificial intelligence or the power of data mining, and the kind of capabilities and the really quite low cost of technology these days. But it's all very well, but delivering for healthcare is actually very challenging. And the reason it's challenging is quite rightly very regulated. Different countries have different regulations, but they all are basically looking to protect patients' privacy, which is quite right. And also, healthcare is extremely complicated. The way it's delivered is inevitably complicated and complex. It involves lots of actors, and there's lots of challenges around capacity and time. And one of the things that people talk about a lot is patient engagement and digitalization. So I think it's clear that the technology exists. There's definitely a demand around using digital technologies, very much driven by patients, but also by clinicians. Everyone's kind of really happy to do it, keen to do it. And in terms of data, we know the wealth of data which is potentially out there and how that could really improve healthcare. But as I say, the trick is working out how to deliver it, how to organize yourself to deliver it. I've worked in different territories in the UK a lot. I just need to give an apology. At the moment, I'm working on a project, targeting the US market. It's a startup, a well-funded startup, looking to launch a data analysis capability, advanced sort of graph database capability into the US market. So my head is full of HIMSS and US regulations, so I might have a bit of a US focus, but as you can understand, when you reach a certain age, you can only keep one thing in your head at a time. So apologies in advance. But let's talk about the pyramid. We all need pyramids, obviously. Apologies to Maslow for this one. And it's really looking at what are the key needs to deliver healthcare successfully and the data project. So if we start at the bottom, agile. This is really talking about the way that we need to organize teams, have the right skills available. Obviously, I think everyone knows that we don't want to deliver using a big, heavy waterfall sort of methodology, which never delivers, just delivers lots of papers. So I think, we do need to organize ourselves around agile methodologies. And this is true for kind of all industries. I think in healthcare, we've got a couple of special needs. One of them is around needing to keep the skills within the team, but also being flexible. This sounds a quite generic statement, but there's a way that, because of the amount of knowledge that people need to deliver to healthcare, what you can't afford is to have your members of your team kind of going not far. I've been working on healthcare for a few months, and then I'm going to go away and do another project on, insurance or transportation, and then I'm going to come back into healthcare. That isn't going to work. However, you need flexibility. So you somehow need flexibility in terms of your resourcing. Obviously, your business case might change and things like this. So it's really squaring that circle. And I think one of the messages I want to give is, that there's a need to have long-term relationships, to have a partner that you can really manage the way that you resource and skill up your teams and keep that kind of core knowledge. And the other thing, and I'll hand over to Gillian, I know that you have a lot to say about this as well, it's not just a technology project. You need clinicians and other, you need a multidisciplinary team. And if you don't get that, you're not really going to understand what healthcare needs. I mean, Gillian, I don't know if you've got any comments on that.
Yes, I think there's definitely advantages in having embedded clinicians. As we move up the pyramid, we can talk about the silos and CPIAs and the governance side of it. But certainly with respect to Agile, there's a language barrier, I think, between tech and healthcare. Now, healthcare professionals can be incredibly busy, often very smart, very good at what they do, but they don't always understand technology, and certainly not how technology is developed in an agile sense. So we do still have a lot of legacy systems that are very closed box and not very flexible and adaptable. And that's what people are used to. And as the new generations come through, they'll get better at this, obviously. But for us old people, it's quite hard to sometimes explain how software is developed when you've got limited time with the clinicians on the front line. And they're used to dealing with really bad IT quite often. They've had a whole career based on that. And so they are used to that waterfall closed box. And to be honest, the procurement systems in the system and are set up to buy things that are already developed. If you go, like Endava might do in other areas, whether it's banking, insurance, payment systems, etc., if you go to a client and say, yes, so what do you need? What's your problem? What's your business? Well, how can I develop software to help that process, to give you your KPIs, your outcomes, safe, secure, etc. You can design that and co-design that with your client and deliver and test and change and deliver and test and change in a sort of cyclical way. It doesn't work like that in healthcare at the moment, and I hope it does move more towards that. But creating a bespoke system for healthcare professionals or area of need is not something that's commonly done. And I think until we can get to that point, our systems are never going to fully address the problems that people need to be addressed. So it's not built on what's your pain, what's your problem, let's give you, an antibiotic to fix that disease and not a vitamin. It's that kind of thing that people tend to expect something's already there. And sometimes I've seen people looking at a system that's entirely adaptable from condition A to condition B, but the people working in condition A can't see it. Or there's a loss of credibility because the language is slightly different. Maybe the blood pressure is not quite rightly displayed. And, there are tools out there that can help you when you're designing clinical systems about the language that you use. But you can learn about other agile ways of working within healthcare. For example, improvement methodology. That's quite based on an agile, improve, look, see, do again until you get the right results. Or in research, there's something called a PDSA, which is Plan, Do, Study, Act. So there is agile, it's just not in the software. And the last thing I'll say is in this area is about business analysts. And I think requirements gathering is not great for healthcare systems. So in order to move to a more tailored or customized solution that will help deliver what the clinicians need, you do need to have good requirements. So there's quite often, certainly from my experience of local authority or health procurements, there isn't space in that for funding for requirement gathering. And I look on the BAs as they could be a really good war correspondent, if you like, embedded in the front line with the clinicians, and they can translate the language from the clinical front line into the tech side. And as Adrian said, that really builds up over time in relationships. So translating that language, getting to know the cultures and embedding the technology teams with the front lines and workers is a good model that doesn't really happen very often.
Yes, and building on what you were saying about the importance of having clinical engagement and that common understanding, common language. I think one of the things that I've certainly found is the need to have a focus on what we call business change a lot, and clinicians involved in that. Gillian, you might want to hold your ears, but even doctors are very clever, but also very opinionated. And sometimes when you're in the room trying to understand what would make their life better, or trying to make them think about a different way of resolving a problem, or accepting a different workflow, or whatever, having another clinician on your side to kind of talk at doctor to doctor level or nurse to nurse level definitely makes it much easier than a non-clinician trying to frankly lecture a clinician on clinical processes. Obviously is impossible. So yeah, business change and understanding that, and what skills you'll need to really resources and skills you'll need to be able to achieve that and get your customers on board with what you're trying to do is kind of fundamental as well. It's really appreciated.
Yeah, absolutely.
If we move to the next need, so safe, we called it, and this is obviously all to do with making sure that the regulatory requirements are met, and it means different things. So we can talk about privacy. We will talk about privacy and security of data, and making sure that patients, that the data that you're using, patients have what either in America have a chance to kind of object, or in the UK have a chance to consent, and so forth. And to make sure that it's secure. That's a technology thing, but there's lots of requirements around upfront design to make sure that any accesses to data, for example, is fully logged and can be reported on. It also really talks about the engineering process. There's a book that I like very much. I think clinicians in the room will have heard of it as well a lot, which is the Checklist Manifesto, which essentially was bringing aviation practices into surgery. And I think in healthcare IT, we need to take the kind of industry-wide practices around engineering discipline and bring it to bear to healthcare. So, for example, if you launch a app or a website or a piece of technology, and there's some kind of adverse reaction, as it would be called, to that app by a patient or by a user, you need to be able to trace that reaction or that incident back to a design decision, back to a requirement, so that you can understand why that happened and what you're going to do about it, etc., etc. In sum, you're kind of treating your software as if it was a drug, and that needs thought and understanding of what that actually means to do it. So it's a wide area, and the key thing, before Gillian, I know you have a few things to say as well, but the key thing is it can't be done as an afterthought. This needs to be baked into the kind of design and approach to delivery, and also the business model of the solution that you're trying to do. So you can't do anything. It's not free and easy. You need to make sure that what you design is going to be compliant and is going to be safe. Gillian, I'm sure you've got a few things to add as well.
Yeah. I think what you said is exactly right, and I think the most important thing there is about not sticking on an IG thought at the end of your development. So I've built this wonderful thing, everyone's going to come and buy it, and it's great, and what about the IG? Where's the data going? What's the access and permissions? How's the data flowing? Have you considered consent? I'm not talking about sort of written consent, but a sort of implied consent or an opt-out option for data sharing. So obviously, if you've got a clinical system that's in use in a hospital or a GP surgery, the patient can't say, I don't want you to use that, because that's not safe. They can't say, I refuse to have my data on your electronic records. So, the doctor needs to be able to use that system to make the patient care safe. But on the other hand, the patient has a right to say, I don't want you to share my data with anyone else, even with commissioners or other people, so it's about data sharing there. And I think the privacy and security by design is so important, and that's where I have an issue with the closed box and the lack of kind of co-design in software development. for clinical services. And I'm not talking about software as a medical device at this point, that's a whole different thing, but sort of any software that's being used within a clinical setting. If you can co-design with clinicians, frontline workers, social care workers, patients, carers, etc., it's going to be much better. And you introduce your IG flows at that point. So you need to almost start thinking about how this is going to be used in the real world in order to design your data protection impact assessment and get, if you can, an IG specialist or someone with knowledge of IG in the healthcare setting in early to help you with that if you don't know how that sort of works. And that's part of the DTAC assessment process, is about your security and your IG. And so DPIA is important. And also just basic common sense. So would a patient reasonably expect that this app would send data to the States? Or would they reasonably expect that this app would be selling data to an insurance company? No, they wouldn't. So you have to tell them that. So, but they would, if they're using a clinical app that their doctor's interfacing with, would they reasonably expect that that information would be shared with the clinical team in that hospital? Of course, yes, they would. So you don't need to consent for that, but you need to just be thinking along that sort of common sense and, having a CSIRO involved and some, as Adrian said, a process of incident reporting is a requirement as well, recognising that, escalating that, along with cyber essentials, which is now becoming a more mandatory part of the software environment. And I think in order to get clinician buy-in, you really have to understand data protection. That is the one thing. First, they'll ask how much does it cost. Second question is who owns the data, and that data governance is always at the top of the questions. And so getting that trust and understanding, if you approach it that I've already thought of this, I have the answers to those questions, and if I don't, I know where I can find out. And also understanding that there is a language. So if you're building software, don't go, this might sound a bit sort of silly, but you could go and show somebody a dummy patient, a simulation on your test site, and that simulation doesn't make clinical sense. To you as a software developer or someone who's selling software, you might think, well, that doesn't really matter. It's just the content on the form. Just change it. But it does matter because you lose credibility. And credibility is really important in this area.
That's right. I mean, one example, and this is a US one, but I'm working for it at the moment, is, and it's just one, it's really just a one random thing, but in America, you can't use genomic data for underwriting decisions. And you can kind of understand exactly why that is there. But obviously, if you're then launching a very advanced data analytics tool, how do you make sure that you don't fall foul of that rule? And there are many other instances of these kind of specific rules that you need to bake into your data model. And the IT guys need to understand that. Another example is they call it attribute-based security. When you talk to people, technical guys, they'll talk about role-based security, and clearly we need that. But in healthcare, for example, your mental health records, you might want to share that with some providers, but not all your providers. Sexual health is another example where, it's particularly sensitive. And so again, that upfront understanding from the IT side of these nuances and really quite advanced issues that need to be baked into the solution from the beginning. And I think, again, it gets to, as Gillian is saying, both sides really having an appreciation of the complexity and the kind of what has to be overcome, and making sure that that understanding is kind of baked into the design at the beginning.
I think it's worth saying, Adrian, at this point that the software as a medical device I think is going to be increasingly prominent as more and more devices have software within them.
Yeah.
And that the CE mark or the MHRA process is another step and another level of complexity. So if you have software that is in a device and that device is operating clinically and that software is an important part of how that device functions, if you then have a change to that software, you have to really know how to map that and trace it back and record it. And, you know, that process may need to be repeated if you're making significant changes. So I think that sort of is a nice as another regulatory sort of framework for medical devices that can be great if you go through the nice process of approval and it's approved, fantastic. But if you go through that process and it's not approved, then again, you've probably lost more credibility. You don't need that, but you do need to have the MHRA process ticked off. And that, if you've got software that's diagnostic in any way. So is this just taking some data from a patient and showing it to the doctor in a slightly different way? So it's a graph, it's representing the same data, the raw data is there, but it just looks better and it's easier to see a tracking, for example, your heart rate. That's not going to be subject to MHRA at the moment, but you should just log it and checklist and say, yes, it does this, it doesn't do that, therefore I don't need to register it. If that software is actually making a clinical decision, or the patient needs more insulin, or some other sort of diagnostic thing that has an impact on the patient, that's a really important thing. So will this software do something outside of what the doctor is doing with the patient independently? You really need to have that as a medical device now. So it's important, again, at the design phase to know exactly what your product is doing.
That's exactly right. Conscious of time, but before we move to the next layer, I just want to add another bit. There's one pattern that is emerging really in terms of design, and that is really to ring. You know, your overall solution will have bits of it which are more sensitive, are medical devices, and bits of it which are not. It's really important that you ring fence and kind of manage which parts of the solution are regulated in which way. But I think that's probably a topic for another day. But if we move to the next layer up, integrated. So clearly in healthcare, nothing's an island. You know, these solutions need to work together. That's where we get the power from it. Actually, healthcare is an industry. Healthcare informatics has got very advanced integration standards which have been developed, you know, over many years. And actually, we owe, as we develop solutions, we kind of owe a debt of gratitude for all the work which has gone on in kind of healthcare integration, which is incredibly complicated because, the meaning of a procedure or meaning of a drug or meaning of a condition is different for different systems, or could be different for different systems, and it can't be. So coding and the structure of data and so forth and so on is highly standardized. You'll hear about HO7, FHIR, things like this. And these are really advanced. A lot of very, very clever people have spent, clinicians and technical guys have spent a long time developing these standards, and they are continually being developed. So, solutions should use these standards if at all possible. There are situations where it's not possible. So, for example, fitness, the fitness ecosystems generally kind of sit outside currently of these standards. So, so have gone their own way, but nevertheless there are kind of standards that I guess are proprietary that should be used. And another example, which is slightly US focused, but has got kind of parallels in the UK, that kind of integration to payers, to insurance companies. So what we're really talking about is making sure that the insurance companies, the payers, the commissioning groups in the UK can look at treatments and understand that treatments are actually justified for that patient. And if you like, you're allowing accountants essentially to look at kind of clinical information in a very controlled way. But standards for this are not that advanced, but it is a major area of kind of change certainly in the US, but I think also in the UK in terms of commissioning groups and those groups trying to develop and ensure that we're getting value for money for the massive investment in healthcare. So integration is really important. Please use standards, please build them via art, but it is a complicated subject, and it's certainly, if we go back to skills, an area where you need to make sure that you've got the right skills in your teams to really understand the integration kind of landscape. Gillian, from a kind of clinical perspective, integrated care pathways and coordinated care, that's a big subject, isn't it?
That is, and we've not cracked that nut yet. So I think integration, not just health, but social, but hospital and community. There's lots of areas where there are organisational silos. And I think integration to me is fundamental, and it should be one of the main priorities for the next few years, is to get that right, because if you can't get data to flow to the right place at the right time, the patient doesn't get the right care in the right place at the right time. So we need to, patients are constantly surprised. So I turn up and the doctor doesn't know my information. It's happened, I hear this all the time, and I think it's shame on us for not allowing that. So I think what we need to do is actually build the ecosystem and use integration as the way to get the data flowing, and not to do what we've done in the past, is just to layer more and more stuff onto the old stuff. So there's legacy systems within hospitals that are just awful, take 5 minutes to open up and take 10 minutes to enter data, and those have become like sort of cancers within the system. It's really difficult to get them taken out. So I think once we've got better integration and data flows, we can start to get rid of some of those old legacy systems, I hope.
And and it's a problem that is not, it sits in other industries as well. I mean, if anyone's worked in insurance or banking, there's some tremendously old systems which people are frankly too scared to change. And I think it's the same in healthcare. Some of these core systems, for a hospital to change their policy, their patient administration systems, is a major investment and a risky project, frankly. So it will always be a problem. I think the standards, fire standards, and there's something called Smarts on Fire. So these are standards really designed to allow devices, and by devices I mean apps and innovation patient devices, to integrate with hospital health systems or national health systems, and therefore share data between them. So I think everyone's pushing in the same direction, but yeah, the technical challenges can't be understated, really. Overstated. The next layout in blue is engaged. So I think I think everyone in this room again will understand healthcare. We've got a big challenge, which is essentially around cost inflation. People are living longer and therefore have more chronic conditions, which cost money to treat. Treatments are becoming more expensive, but better, much better. I mean, people are living longer because of them, but treatments are becoming more complicated and more costly. And I think patients are expecting more from the healthcare system. So this is all driving health inflation, cost inflation. And the policy response to that is patient engagement, getting people to understand their health and their bodies better, understanding the information that, and understanding what they need to do to better manage their health. So this could be kind of the well people, keeping well. If you imagine the pyramid, the previous pyramid that we're looking at, but it's also, people with chronic conditions and managing them much better. And so we're really looking at what does it mean to make an application or a system which really engages patients, allows them to really understand their conditions and understand what they should be doing, and motivating them to move in the right direction. And the one thing I would say is, obviously UI and UX, the design of the user interface is really important. And it's not just art. I mean, there's lots of art involved in a great user design, but actually it's an engineering discipline, and we need to channel our inner Apple, I think, and really look at how Apple take user experience and user design as an engineering practice, get lots of feedback, understand the needs of users, iterate around that design, have ways of sort of testing how people, testing in a scientific way how people kind of interact with an object in terms of what they're looking at, what they're touching, what their expectations are. There's a great book called The Humane Interface. I've got it right in front of me here, actually. You can't see me. The Humane Interface. Old book. It was written by one of the founders of Apple. Definitely well worth reading because it makes you understand kind of the work really that Apple did from the get-go to make their systems really compelling. But so it's something that can't be done by accident. It's not just art. It's not an art like all these things. It's not something you can do at the end. You really need to understand how your solution is going to engage users and engage the kind of whole ecosystem. Gillian, I guess you've seen some great and bad systems in your time.
Yes, I think you hit the nail on the head. You said, how will it be used? Will it be used? I think you can't assume that if you build something, people will be queuing up to use it or buy it. Commissioners will always look for the zero cost option. So what you're delivering has to solve a problem. There has to be some kind of business case and value proposition in there. But also I think there's a gazillion apps and people often download them and then they don't use them again. And that's, I think, because we're not really communicating with that device. So there's perhaps a fall off because, there's studies on this, that patients get given an app or they have remote monitoring of some sort, there's a whole bank of data, and they expect that the clinicians are going to be looking at that and acting on it. And that's just not possible. Or they take it to the doctor and it's like, well, yeah, I've got 5 minutes, I don't have time to look at this. So you've got to manage expectations, and there's some studies show patients just switch off because their expectations are not being met, and their expectations may not be reasonable. So it's entirely appropriate that they're not met, but that has to be explained. And so how do we get those apps or patient records actually useful for patients in their daily lives? So what's in it for them, basically? It's not, there's still a sense, I think, in doctors that this is my data. It's really not. You're just using that data to do your job, but it's actually the patient's data. So I think at some time in the future, I'd like to see the patient fully own and hold that information, and they decide who it's shared with and how for research or service improvement. But also that we try to work out what, it can be quite daunting. I don't know how many apps for diabetes, so many, COPD, etc. And some of them are great and they're used by patients, and it makes a difference to their daily lives. It makes it easier for them to handle their information, to share information, and that's fantastic. That's what I think we should be aiming for. But quite often that doesn't happen. So all that development time just sits there. And I think quite a number of apps, one of the Orca talks I listened to a couple of years ago, I think something like 85% when they did a study of apps that were actually approved at that time on the list, the healthcare approval, had not had an update in the previous 3 years. So I think getting patients involved, getting users involved, thinking how it will be used and what's the value is important, again, at the design stage.
Yes. I think I have high blood pressure, which I take medication for. So the most simple and common condition, I guess, for a middle-aged guy. And I went through that same thing of kind of religiously recording my blood pressure into a spreadsheet or, into different apps, and then talking to the GP about them. And the poor GP was thinking, wasn't that interested at one level because, she knew what she wanted, if that makes sense. And we went through a kind of process of titration of the medication, etc., etc. The problem with the apps for blood pressure is I know it's slightly raised, but what I want the app to do is sort of like say, yeah, it's slightly raised, but it's kind of fine, which is what the GP says, or actually, no, it seems to be, there's a trend, it's kind of moved out of a range that we kind of expect it to be in, which is what I panic about secretly. Therefore you need to go back to the GP and maybe up your medication or do something. So it's up, and a lot of apps are designed for well people, but of course if you've got an illness, all your readings are going to be wrong or are going to be out of band, and they don't really engage and take a patient on a journey of understanding that that's kind of fine or that isn't fine. But that's my personal experience. And finally, I think everyone who knows Maslow knows that the top has to be called self. And what we're really talking about here is personalized care. And, personalized care can be really advanced in terms of, using genomic information to kind of manage different oncology treatments and all this sort of stuff. Really advanced kind of clinical personalized treatment. But it can be as simple, in inverted commas, simple as personalizing care, understanding, the travel needs of an individual or their preferences, in terms of advanced directives or, whether they prefer to see this or that doctor or whatever. So it can be very clinically advanced, or it can be really around the patient and their needs and wishes at if you like, a personal level. And there is an expectation that healthcare can be personalized, but I think everyone knows that without technology, it's impossible. We can't afford enough nurses to kind of personalize care and give that kind of individual attention without technology. But by personalizing it, it will make a big difference, and that's kind of what technology has to solve. So the example that I've seen in the project that Endava did actually, but was around aged care in the US, and it was about really looking at data about people in aged care and their readmission rates, and it was designed to kind of predict readmission and therefore understand what actions would be needed to kind of reduce readmission. And the great thing is, and it was a successful project and successful outcome, and the great thing about it is clearly it makes life better for the patients because they're spending more time at home or more time out of hospital. And it's great for the health system because it's reducing costs. So it's better outcomes that reduce costs. It's kind of exactly why we all are working in healthcare. And it's this kind of personalization which really can move the needle. And again, to really achieve it, you need that multidisciplinary team, because you do need people who are data scientists, have that kind of mathematical background. You do need people who have got a clinical background. You need technologists. You need people who can really translate an algorithm to an acceptable kind of clinical protocol, I guess. But for me, it's kind of what it's all about. I mean, Gillian, I know that you share the passion as well.
Yes, no, I think all of the above. I agree. I think it's really important to make technology that enables care that makes sense and makes a difference. And unfortunately, because of time constraints, we can't get into the ethics, bias, explainability of AI or anything like that. But that's a whole other talk, I think. But yeah, I think we could spend quite a lot of time on this topic, but we've run out of time.
Yeah, and I think this is why we've got the pyramid, because this is what we're trying to achieve at the top. But actually, you can't do that without everything below it. We can't. We need the skills. We need to make sure that it's kind of regulatory and clinically safe. It for sure needs to be integrated into the wider ecosystem, and if it isn't engaging patients and clinicians, it's not going to make a difference. And when you've got all those right, then you can really move on to focusing on how to make it individually tailored. Anyway, that's the view. That's my view. Garry, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've probably reached a natural inflection point, as you might say, in the webinar, and I don't think we've had any questions formally, but I'm sure there'll be some behind the scenes, so to speak. So for those on the call, on the webinar, a member of my team would be in touch to follow up to pick up with those, so that we don't miss any opportunity to complete the discussion, and of course carry on if you'd like to speak to either Gillian or Adrian outside of this webinar. We'd very much be keen for that to happen. So I guess it just leaves me to say thank you to all of you for attending what I hope you found was a insightful and relevant session. Clearly, skating across the surface of some significant pieces of work. In front of you, you'll see a health tech white paper that is available on delivering the connected patient. If you don't already have that, I'd very much be happy to provide. And again, that can be something that we follow up on. Special thanks to our expert panel, Dr. Gillian Halley and Adrian Sutherland, for hosting today. And thank you all again for those attending and those listening afterwards. This then ends today's webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.